Hello and welcome to my channel. And this lecture will continue our talk about the cerebral vasculature, the venous side. So let's begin. The venous drainage of the brain comprises two systems: the dural venous sinuses system and the cerebral vein system. Of course, you know that dural venous sinuses, they don't have a muscular wall, so any bleeding from a dural venous sinus cannot be controlled. But the cerebral vein system are regular vessels that have a muscular wall. The dural venous sinuses lined with epithelium, and there are spaces between in the spaces between the outer and inner dural layers, the outer periosteal and the inner fibrous layer, as we studied before, and they all eventually empty in the internal jugular vein. They include the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, etc. We will discuss each of them individually. The superior sagittal sinus, it's this sinus. See that? It's big at the upper end of the falx cerebri, so begins at the cribriform plate and ends in the confluence of sinuses, and usually continues as the right transverse sinus. The blood is of large quantity in this sinus, so the right transverse sinus will be larger than the left transverse sinus. It will groove the bone more than the left side. So that the right mastoid bone is thinner than the left. It communicates with the lateral lacunae containing arachnoid granulations to drain the CSF, and it receives blood from the superior surface of the cerebral hemispheres, diploic and emissary veins, and from falx cerebri. This is the superior sagittal sinus. The inferior sagittal sinus is the one that you see here. It's in the free border of the falx cerebri. It ends by joining the great cerebral vein of Galen to form the straight sinus, and usually the blood continues to the left as the left transverse sinus at the top of the tentorium cerebelli. The meeting, at the top of the meeting with the great cerebral vein of Galen as at the top of tentorium cerebelli. It will form the straight sinus, which continues posteriorly through the junction of tentorium cerebelli and falx cerebri, and usually continues to the left side, as mentioned before, and receives from posterior and deep brain surfaces, superior cerebellar veins, and from falx cerebri. Confluence of sinuses is the one you see here. At the opposite the internal occipital protuberance, and drains straight sinus, superior sagittal sinus, and occipital sinuses. And the confluence of sinuses is drained by the right and left transverse sinuses. Transverse sinuses, they are right and left transverse. They drain the superior sagittal sinus. This is the left transverse, as you see here. Drains also the straight and superior petrosal sinuses, and veins from the inferior parts of the hemispheres, cerebellum, emissary veins. It becomes the sigmoid sinus that will form the internal jugular vein. The sigmoid sinus will run inferiorly, grooving the parietal, temporal, and occipital bones, and end at the beginning of the internal jugular vein. It receives blood from the cerebral, cerebellar veins, and diploic and emissary veins. Okay? The cavernous sinus is the one you see here on both sides of the sella turcica. Sella turcica means the Turkish saddle, because it's saddle shape and it has a pituitary gland or the hypophysis in it, and it receives from the ophthalmic vein, the sphenoparietal vein. As you can see here, this is the ophthalmic vein, sphenoparietal vein, and receives also emissary veins from the pterygoid venous plexus in the infratemporal fossa. Remember the pterygoid venous plexus in the substance of the lateral pterygoid muscle mainly. Structures passing in the sinus are liable to injury in case of infection. The structures are internal carotid artery, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. This is the way I remember it. 3 is the oculomotor and trochlear nerves are at the roof. The ophthalmic and maxillary nerves are at the side walls or the lateral walls, and abducens nerve is in the floor of the sinus. It connects with the other cavernous sinus by intercavernous sinuses. See the intercavernous sinuses, the ones you see here around the pituitary stalk, and it drains, as mentioned before, the sphenoparietal sinuses along the lesser wing of the sphenoid and diploic and meningeal veins. Drains into the superior petrosal, the one you see here, and the inferior petrosal. The superior petrosal and the inferior petrosal. So the superior and inferior petrosals drain the cavernous sinus, while the cavernous sinus itself drains the ophthalmic vein and the sphenoparietal sinus. Superior and inferior petrosal sinuses. This is the superior petrosal sinus, begins at the end of the cavernous sinus and goes backwards to open into the end of the transverse sinus. Means it forms with the transverse sinus the sigmoid sinus, beginning of the sigmoid sinus, while the inferior petrosal sinus goes down between the occipital and temporal bones and ends in the internal jugular vein itself. It drains, as mentioned before, the cavernous sinus, cerebellar veins, internal ear, and brainstem veins. The basilar sinus, this is the basilar sinus. See the basilar sinus. On the clivus, this region of the occipital bone, it's called the clivus. It's opposite the brainstem, and connect both inferior petrosal sinuses and vertebral venous plexus. Cerebral veins, these are the cerebral veins. They classify them, it's classified into 3 groups: superior cerebral veins or superolateral cerebral veins, the middle cerebral veins, and the inferior cerebral veins. The superolateral cerebral veins count from 8 to 12. They are the veins you see here. See how they open into the superior sagittal sinus. The middle cerebral vein this is the superficial middle cerebral vein in the lateral sulcus, and it's connected by anastomotic veins. So they are cut here. Anastomotic vein, superior anastomotic vein of Trollard and inferior anastomotic vein of Levy. This is the inferior anastomotic vein to the transverse sinus. The superior anastomotic vein, of course, connects it to the superior sagittal sinus. The inferior cerebral group are frontal, temporal, and occipital areas of the brain. So again, the veins are divided into superior cerebral, middle cerebral, and inferior cerebral groups. Basal vein of Rosenthal begins at anterior perforated substance. I showed you the anterior perforated substance before at the inferior surface of the brain. It receives the anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and striate veins and drains into the great cerebral vein of Galen. This is the great cerebral vein of Galen. The internal cerebral vein, these are the internal cerebral veins, see? They join to form the great cerebral vein of Galen, and they begin at the interventricular foramen of Monroe by the union of the thalamus striate and choroid veins. See? The choroid veins and thalamus striate veins, they form the internal cerebral veins, which unite together to form the great cerebral vein of Galen. It's formed by the union of two internal cerebral veins in the superior cistern. Remember the superior cistern above the cerebellum, and drains into the straight sinus. Actually, it forms the straight sinus with the inferior sagittal sinus, as we studied before. Superior and inferior cerebellar veins, they drain into the straight sinus, and veins around the brainstem make plexuses deep to arteries and drain in the nearby veins. Okay, we are done with the venous drainage of the brain and the brainstem. To recap, two major systems: the sagittal, the dural venous sinuses system, and the cerebral vein system. Now, they are part of the cerebral blood flow. Factors affecting cerebral blood flow: first of all, the CO2 pressure. When it increases, it combines with water and forms bicarb and H. The H is responsible for the increase of the increase of the acidity or decrease of pH, and it causes vasodilation. Now, this vasodilation happens to wash away the CO2 and acidic metabolites that leads to this will eventually leads to return of the H to the normal values. Increase in the H due to exercise leads to accumulation of lactic acid, as you know. This will cause vasodilation and increase in cerebral blood flow. Also, 5% increase in the pressure, or CO2 pressure, doubles the CBF, or cerebral blood flow. Also, hypoxia, decrease in O2, leads to reflex vasodilation. Increase in potassium depresses neurons, so affects depolarization and leads to vasodilation of capillaries. An accumulation of nitrous oxide also leads to vasodilation. So these are the factors responsible for that, or affecting the cerebral blood flow. Remember, the nitrous oxide, potassium, the PCO2, the hypoxia, the increase in H. This all affects the cerebral blood flow. Cerebral microcirculation means the capillaries. The number of capillaries in the gray matter is 4 times more than that in the white matter, and so blood flow in the gray matter is more than white matter. This explains it. Also, the capillaries, remember the blood-brain barrier, we talked about the tight junctions between the endothelium and the basilar membrane and the podocytes of the astrocytes that converge on the brain vessels. This prevents leaks from the vessels and prevents overstretching with increase in the blood pressure. When pressure increases, this leads to leak from capillaries and edema develops, cerebral edema. Strokes that occur in the brain. Strokes are of two types, either the occlusive type. This occurs in the elderly and due to atherosclerosis, the main reason. And hemorrhagic type means rupture of the vessel. This is a brief idea about the cerebral microcirculation. one of the common clinical findings is the cerebral edema, especially due to concussion. It's fluid accumulating in the extracellular in gray matter, or the between the fibers of the white matter. This is called interstitial, or intracellular. This is called the cytotoxic type of cerebral edema. The cerebral edema, it's due to increase in capillary pressure or damage to capillaries. And I told you before, its most common cause is concussion. Once edema develops, this will lead that cerebral blood flow will reflex decreases, and this will lead to two vicious circles. When edema develops, it compresses the vessels and leads to decrease the cerebral blood flow, which leads to leading to ischemia and or hypoxia, and reflex vasodilation occurs, as we studied before, and this will lead to increased capillary pressure and more edema develops. So this is one of the two causes of the vicious circle. The other cause is ischemia. It increases the capillary permeability. That leads to increase the leak. So the edema physically compresses the vessels, and this leads to decreased cerebral blood flow, which leads to ischemia and reflex vasodilation. And the ischemia also increases capillary permeability, that leads to increase leak. How to treat that? The treatment is by solution of high osmotic concentration substance such as mannitol. Okay, that was also a brief idea about the cerebral edema. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.